Day 50, very exciting, big milestone for me. Hello, class, or maybe, hello, congregation. Please turn in your Bibles to page 368. We're starting a new chapter. It's called Chapter 20, 1 Year. I have to be really hydrated because I'm a little hungover. On January 19, 1934, Governor Lehman signed the legislation allowing Robert Moses to become the first commissioner of a statewide park department. At 5 p.m. that same day, Mayor LaGuardia swore Moses into office at City Hall. As soon as his right hand came down from the oath, Moses turned to the assembled reporters and told them that he had an announcement to make. The 5 borough park commissioners and the 5 borough park superintendents, along with the commissioners' personal secretaries and stenographers, and assorted deputy commissioners and other top-level park aides, were fired. As of now. Oh my, what an exciting way to start out day 50. The next morning at 9 a.m., a fleet of chauffeured black Packards roamed up the curb on Fifth Avenue in front of the Arsenal. Out of them stepped Moses and a squad of top Long Island aides. These men would be running the park department from now on, Moses announced. Leading them up the steps of the Arsenal, which he announced would henceforth be departmental headquarters, he assigned them offices. Moses had given these men their orders. They were to weed out immediately those headquarters employees who would not or could not work at the pace he demanded. The weeding out would be accomplished by making all employees work at that pace immediately. Unlike the commissioners and their personal secretaries, most headquarters employees were protected by civil service, but that didn't help them much. Men who lived in the Bronx were told that henceforth they would be working in Staten Island. Men in Staten Island were assigned to the Bronx, or they were given tasks so disagreeable that they couldn't stomach them. Women were treated no better. One ancient biddy, B-I-D-D-Y, accustomed to spending her days at the Arsenal knitting in a rocking chair, refused to admit that she was over retirement age and gracefully accepted a pension. When a search failed to produce a birth certificate to disprove her story, she was ordered to work overtime all night. Every time she tried to rest, she was ordered to keep working. She retired at 2 a.m. Down at his State Parks Council office at 80 Center Street, Moses was never to have an office at the Arsenal and was to visit the building infrequently during his 26 years as park commissioner because he didn't want to be accessible to departmental employees. Moses was confronting the CWA. Its officials were worried themselves about the demoralization of the 68,000 relief workers in the parks. Moses told them that the first requirement for getting those men working on worthwhile projects was to provide them with plans. Blueprints in volume were needed, he said, and they were needed immediately. If you're just joining, Moses just got 2 new gigs. Well, he got a new gig as a city park commissioner, but he's already the state park commissioner. So now he's like the big boss, and he just fired everyone, and he's making it really intense in the city so that he weeds out all the employees that aren't really dedicated. Blueprints in volume were needed, he said, and they were needed immediately. He must be allowed to hire the best architects and engineers available and must be allowed to hire them fast. The CWA must forget about its policy of keeping expenditures for plans small to keep as much money as possible for salaries for men in the field. The agency must forget its policy that only unemployed men could be hired so that Moses could hire a good architect even if he was already working as a dig ditcher or was being kept on by a firm at partial salary. And the agency must drop its rule that no worker could be paid more than $30 per week. The CWA refused. Rules were rules, it said. "I quit," Moses said. LaGuardia hastily intervened. After 7 days of haggling, the CWA surrendered. Moses was given permission to hire 600 architects and engineers without regard to present job status and to pay them up to $80 per week. So that he could hire them as fast as possible, he was even given an emergency allocation to summon them to interviews not by letter, but by telegram. Fancy schmancy. The CWA capitulated on the morning of January 27. By noon, 1,300 telegrams were being delivered to carefully selected architects and engineers all over New York State, telling each of them that if he was interested in a job, he should report to the arsenal the next day. No profession had been hit harder than architecture and engineering. Engineers were particularly reluctant to accept relief. "I simply had to murder my pride," one said. "We'd lived on bread and water for 3 weeks before I could make myself do it." But The Nation estimated that fully half of all engineers were out of work, and 6 out of 7 architects. These men had been hiding out in public libraries to avoid meeting anyone they knew, or trampeding the streets carrying their customary attaché cases, although those cases contained only a sandwich. Although the park department interviews weren't supposed to begin on January 28 until 2 p.m., on that day, with the temperature below freezing, when dawn broke over the city, it disclosed a line of shivering men outside the arsenal. The line began at the front door. It wound down the steps out to 5th Avenue at 64th Street and along the avenue to 72nd Street. Fully 8 blocks of architects in line. The interviewing went on all day. Some of the men who had been waiting in line before dawn couldn't get into the arsenal until late afternoon. But for 600 of them, the wait was worth it. When you got inside, nobody asked you how much money you had in the bank or what was the maiden name of your great-grandmother, one architect recalls. All they asked you was, "What are your qualifications?" Those whose qualifications satisfied Moses's were hired on the spot, shown to the arsenal's garage in which drafting tables had been set up, handed assignments, and were told to get to work. In the evening, some started to go home. Those whose assignments didn't have to be finished for a few days were allowed to do so. Several hundred, whose plans were needed faster, were told flatly, "If you go home tonight, don't come back tomorrow." Without exception, these men stayed, catching naps on cots Moses had set up in the arsenal's corridors. This reminds me of like when Elon Musk bought Twitter at first. Out in the parks, the ragtag ranks of the CWA workers were being shaped up. Moses had found the men to do the shaping. Out of fear of losing them permanently to rivals, idle construction contractors were struggling to keep on salary their field superintendents, the foremen or ramrods, whose special gift for whipping tough Irish laborers into line made them an almost irreplaceable asset. Pointing out that the CWA was not a rival and would probably go out of existence whenever business improved, Moses persuaded contractors throughout New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and New England to give him their best ramrods, the toughest you've got. And when the new men arrived, 300 in the first batch, 450 within 2 more months, his instructions to them were equally explicit. CWA workers, he was to say later, were not accustomed to work under people who really drove them. I see to it that my men do drive them. Wow, there are more people here. Hello. We're on chapter 10 on page 370. Moses just got the double gig of a city job and a state job, so he has a lot of power. And it's the Great Depression, and so they have the New Deal workers who are kind of they haven't been working so hard because they just randomly set up this agency and stuff. And so he's hiring. Yeah, it was barely legal because he wrote one of the laws that included a little line about it. Because one of them he doesn't accept a salary from. But yeah, he's like trying to whip the crew into shape. So he's hiring the toughest people. Yeah, that's what's happening. Arriving at Marine Park on January 31st, new Superintendent Percy H. Keena ordered the men away from their bonfires, and when some moved too slowly for him, he fired 66 on the spot. The men refused to leave. They moved threateningly toward him, and they noticed that patrol cars crammed with policemen had quietly driven up behind them. On the same day, with patrol cars backing them up, new superintendents fired hundreds of other workers in parks. If this method disposed of malingerers and malcontents, it nonetheless proved difficult to whip the relief workers who remained into an efficient workforce. Most wanted to work at the pace demanded, but were unable to do so. The suits, overcoats, and fedoras many wore while wielding shovels were testimony not only to their inability to afford warmer work clothes, but also to their lack of experience in performing hard physical labor outdoors. Even in mild weather, they would have had difficulty. In winter, they suffered bitterly from exposure. Since their pay was $13.44 per week, many were still scrimping on their own food so that their children could have more. I remember guys just keeling over on the job. That's never a good sign, one laborer recalls. And you always knew that it was just that they had come to work without anything to eat. And they were scrimping in other ways too. A worker at Diker Beach Park on the south edge of Brooklyn, who had caught a reporter's eye because the side of his neck is swollen and his breath is from a sick throat, told the reporter that he lived in Manhattan. Shivering in a thin overcoat, he said, "To get to work, I walk for 4 hours. I set the alarm clock for 2:30 and I start walking 3:45. The reporter asked him why he didn't take a trolley. "Car fare is 20 cents a day," he replied. Some of the new superintendents quietly handed quarters to laborers whose inability to keep up was due to hunger or frostbite. Others just fired them. But none of the ramrods stopped driving. If they did, they knew they would be fired themselves. They were, after all, working for a boss who, when questioned about the new wave of firing that almost touched off riots in several parks, said, "The government and the taxpayers have a right to demand an adequate return in good work, faithfully performed for the money that is being spent. We inherited men who were working without plan and without supervision. The plans have now been made, the supervision is being supplied, and we expect the men to work." The winter of 1934 was the first of 5 of the most severe in New York history. The temperature dropped below zero on 5 different days. On one day, it hit 14 below, and a steady succession of heavy storms dumped a total of 52 inches of snow on the city. The mean temperature for the entire month of February was 11.5 degrees. But all through that winter, the residents of the tall apartment houses rimming Central Park could look down on the park and see, in the snow, thousands of men swinging pickaxes and shovels, climbing ladders set against trees, swarming over scaffolding erected around the older structures, and building new ones. From behind the park's granite block walls came the pounding of pneumatic drills, the rumble of concrete mixers, the dull roar of steam shovels, and the sharp rapping of hammers. This is one of the most, visually appearing descriptions of people working that we've had in this book since the last time, a few chapters ago when he had to plant beach grass on that one Long Island Park because of some silly mistake. And so he just had everyone inserting beach grass. That was another good scene. Anyway, you prefer the children digging. Oh yeah, that one, that actually might have been the best. It was a scene where they were talking about how they didn't really have good parks, and so they just described, like, children had to line up, and you imagine them lining up, like, for blocks just to dig a hole, and then they would have to get ushered away, and then the next kid would come up and dig a hole. It was a really great scene. And to the consternation of those apartment house residents, this clangor did not stop at 5 o'clock. At dusk, thousands of men filed into Central Park to replace those who had been working during the day. And when the watchers in the apartment houses retired for the night, for nights that they complained were made restless by the noise, they could take a last look out their windows and see the pickaxes were still swinging in the harsh glare of hundreds of high-powered carbide lamps. When they awoke in the morning, the pickaxes were still swinging, and they realized that a third shift had filed into the park during the night. The work was going on 24 hours a day, and from behind the granite block walls of Prospect Park, the high wooden fence left around Bryant Park from the George Washington Bicentennial celebration. Oh, that one, what a callback. And a score of others erected that winter by Moses around other parks came the same clangor on the same schedule. Late in the afternoon of February 22, heavy snow began to fall. It continued falling all through the 23rd, dumping a total of 18 inches on the city. But during those days, the rebuilding of New York's parks never stopped. Sometimes now, the laborers were even performing the construction phenomenon known as working ahead of plans. By February, there were more than 800 architects and engineers in the arsenal, and they had become accustomed to working 14-hour days. But often, after they had finished a blueprint and it had been approved by Clark, Embry, Andrews, or some other supervisor, and they rushed it themselves out to the project site, they would find that the work crews had already begun or even finished digging ditches for pipes and foundations or other preliminary work. And they would have to sit down on the spot and draw new plans to fit in with the work that had already been completed. The team of 15 architects working at the Arsenal under Embry's personal direction to design a new Central Park zoo, Moses didn't like the name Menagerie, were, Latham recalls, working while looking out the window to see what had already been done. These men, Embry wrote in amazement, had never seen each other before beginning work. They had to work with little equipment, crowded together, 2 or 3 on the table, and moved about from one place to another every few days. They completed the plans for the entire new zoo in 16 days. Embry and Clark themselves, giants of their professions, though they were caught up in the excitement. Once, going out to lunch together, they stopped at Bryant Park to review the reconstruction work, which was already well underway, and they decided they didn't like the plan, already approved by themselves and Moses, on which hundreds of men were already working. Over lunch, they began to discuss new ideas and sketched them out on their tablecloth. When they finished their meal, they asked the head waiter for permission to take the tablecloth with them, drove straight to 80 Center Street to show it to Moses, and when he approved, gave another team of draftsmen to translate into blueprints. Wow, just drawn on the tablecloth. It's sad that that's not in a museum anywhere. By March, the economy was beginning to recover and optimism was rising. Along with demands from the nation's press, heavily anti-New Deal, that the government begin phasing out the spending of taxpayers' money on such socialistic practices as work relief. I wouldn't have guessed that the press was so anti-New Deal. I wonder why that was. Moses had been led to expect an extension of the act creating CWA. But at the last moment, Congress changed its mind and the agency went out of existence on March 31st on 48 hours' notice. With only a limited amount of funds from the Federal Emergency Relief Administration available for park work, half of Moses's men were abruptly dismissed. But he kept the remaining half working. The harshness of the winter persisted into April, and every weekend was either cold or rainy. But on Saturday, May 1st, 1934, the weather turns balmy, and as they do the first warm Saturday of every spring, New Yorkers poured into their parks. 1,700 of the 1,800 renovation projects had been completed. Every structure in every park in the city had been repainted. Every tennis court had been resurfaced. Every lawn had been reseeded. 8 antiquated golf courses had been reshaped. 11 miles of bridle paths rebuilt. 38 miles of walks repaved. 145 comfort stations renovated. 284 statues refurbished. 678 drinking fountains repaired. 7,000 waste paper baskets replaced. 22,500 benches reslatted. Wait, now I'm going to do a game for you if you want. And I'm going to say the topic and you have to guess what the number is. How many dead trees do you think removed? You can guess in the chat if you want, or not. You can just guess in your head, or not at all. Okay, dead trees removed. Guess how many were put in their place, if you want. Okay, yeah, that was pretty. It was 7,000 dead trees removed. Then there were 11,000 put in their place. Okay, guess how many trees got pruned? I don't even know if this is a fun game. I'll just tell. Okay, 62,000 trees got pruned. 86 miles of fencing, most of it unnecessary, was torn down, and 19 miles of new fencing installed in its place. Every playground in the city had been resurfaced, not with cinders, but with a new type of asphalt that Moses' engineers assured him would prevent skinned knees. And every playground had been re-equipped with jungle gyms, slides, and sandboxes for children and benches for their mothers. And around each playground had been planted trees for shade. Generations of New Yorkers, as the Times put it, have grown up in the firm belief that park benches are green by law of nature, like the grass itself. But now, as New Yorkers strolled through their parks, they saw that benches had been painted a cool cafe au lait. Generations of New Yorkers had believed that the 6 miles of granite walls around Central Park were a grimy, blackish gray. Now they saw that sandblasting had restored them to their original color, a handsome dark cream. Rare was the New Yorker who could remember when the Columbus Circle monument to the men who died in the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor had not been dingy. Or when the boy standing in the prow of the monument's bow had possessed a reef, or for that matter, hands to hold it with. As soon as, okay, I like that we're talking about Central Park because now I totally can picture this stuff in my head because I've been there many times. But I haven't been to very many of the Bronx beaches. So whenever we talk about that, I have no real mental image. As soon as Moses had taken office, he had surrounded the monument with scaffolding and had concealed it with drop cloths. Now the scaffolding and drop cloths were removed, and the boy had his hands back, and a wreath was in them, and the entire huge monument behind him had been scrubbed clean and white. A weird sound outside. And 1,000 plots in the parks, plots which, as long as New Yorkers could remember, had contained nothing but dirt and weeds, were gay with spring blooming flowers. By midsummer, new construction projects in the parks were being completed. 10 new golf courses, 6 new golf houses, 240 new tennis courts, 3 new tennis houses, and 51 new baseball diamonds were to be opened to the public before Labor Day. I lost my phone. The Prospect Park Zoo, miss it, was completely rebuilt and a new zoo erected at Barrett Park on Staten Island. Complete reconstruction jobs were done on St. James, Crotona, and Maycombs Dam parks in the Bronx. Owl's Head, McCarran, and Fort Greene parks in Brooklyn. I know those parks. Crocherone, Chisholm, and Casina parks in Queens, and Mount Morris, Manhattan Square, and Carl Schurz parks in Manhattan. The only ones I've been to are Prospect Park, Fort Greene, and McCarran from this list. On a sunny Saturday, the fence around Bryant Park came down, and thousands of spectators in a reviewing stand set up behind the Lowell Fountain saw that the weed-filled lot had been transformed into a magnificent formal garden. And remember that Bryant Park went through a lot in the past decade, in the 20s and 30s? The short version is that there was a bicentennial celebration of George Washington's birth, and so then these like scammy political hacks thought it would be a good way to make money, so they made this like really cheap plaster building, and they charged people to get in with turnstiles, and they thought they were going to make a ton of money, but then they didn't make any money. Nobody really cared or wanted to see it, and they like then they lost a bunch of money, and then they just let the big plaster structure crumble, and they also lost the statues that had previously been in the park, and then later they were just found under a Williamsburg Bridge. Okay, so it was a weed-filled lot, but it had been transformed into a magnificent formal garden. 200 large plane trees, grown in Moses's Long Island Park Commission nurseries, trucked to the city and then lifted over the fence and lowered into prepared holes by giant cranes, had been planted along its edges, and their broad leaves shaded graceful benches and long flower beds bordered by low, neat hedges. The 4 acres they surrounded were 4 acres of lush and neatly trimmed grass, set off by long, low stone balustrades, don't know what that is, and flower-bordered flagstone walks that looked all the greener against the grayness of the masses of concrete stores and office buildings around it. As a newly formed 66-piece park department band, outfitted in white duck trousers, forest green jackets with white belt and white caps trimmed with green and gold braid, blew a fanfare. The great-granddaughter of William Cullen Bryant, the poet and journalist for whom the park had been named, and the sister of Mrs. Josephine S. Lowell, in whose memory the fountain had been built, walked together from the reviewing stand to the fountain, escorted by 20 youthful pages and park department attendants in uniform, and flung handfuls of petals into it. At that signal, water gushed from the fountain's 5 dolphin spouts for the first time in a decade, and a speaker said that Robert Moses had outdone his biblical namesake, because while the Moses of the Israelites had smote a rock in the desert and brought forth water, Moses of New York had smote the city's parks and brought forth not only water, but trees, grass, and flowers. I can't believe they had a parks department band. That's kind of like how these days New York City Police Department has a dance team, and they performed on like it wasn't the Ellen show. It might have been the Kelly Clarkson show or something. In Central Park, Moses's men restored Olmsted's long defaced buildings, replanted the Shakespeare Garden, placing next to every flower a quotation from the bard in which it was mentioned, and exterminated herds of rats. 230 dead ones were counted in a single week at the zoo site alone. While several hundred men were working night and day to build a new zoo, another 1,000 were transforming the dried-up reservoir bed that had been called Hoover Valley. Moses had torn down the shantytown there into a verdant 30-acre great lawn where we're laying flagstone walks around it and planting along them hundreds of Japanese cherry trees. I didn't know that the Great Lawn in Central Park was Hoover Valley. I didn't know that. Then, having satisfied those who objected to use of the reservoir bed entirely for active play, Moses constructed a playground and a wading pool in the northeast corner of the bed, outside the lawn's borders for small children, and a game field in the northwest corner for older children. On the north meadow, he built handball courts, wading pools, and 13 baseball diamonds. He deported the deformed sheep and turned the old sheepfold into a tavern on the green, an old English inn in a park, complete with doormen wearing riding boots and hustling coats and top hats, and cigarette girls in court costumes, complete with bustles. And when the added touch of an outdoor flagstone terrace on which couples could dance among tables shaded by gaily covered umbrellas to the music of a 12-piece orchestra costumed in forest green. Okay, I just have to share a little something about my life. The first time I went to New York was when I was in 7th grade. My family road tripped from Michigan, and the parents were like, "Okay, like Annie, what is there anything like you want to do to add to the list?" My brothers all had things they wanted to do, and I just was like, "I want to see celebrities," and so I just Googled all the best places to spot celebrities, and one of them was Tavern on the Green, and it's just a bar in Central Park. But I made my family stay there for so long. They kept being like, "Annie, can we leave yet?" And I was like, "No, I feel like," I just was convinced that Taylor Swift was gonna walk right in. No one did, but that was me when I was 12. I don't know why I cared so much. And Moses was not merely beautifying the city's parks. He was doing what generations of reformers had despaired of doing. He was creating new ones in the areas that needed them. In his first flush of enthusiasm following LaGuardia's offer of the park commissionership, Moses had believed that by forcing landlords to dump real estate on the market at a fraction of its former value, the Depression had given the city, at last, a chance to acquire and tear down slum tenements and use this space, thus gained, for play space for the slum children who so badly needed it. But then LaGuardia disclosed to him the extent of the city's financial crisis and told him that, because of the Depression, even fractions were beyond the city's ability to pay. I remember one time he came back from talking to LaGuardia and told us this, said Bill Latham. And I remember that he said then, I don't remember the words really, but the idea was, all right then, God damn it, we'll get land without money. I wonder if at this point, like he could remember when he used to call his mom to borrow her money to buy plots of land for the Long Island Parkway. I wonder if he's going to keep doing that. Moses instructed Latham to set his surveyors by making an inventory of every piece of publicly owned land in New York City, every tract or parcel owned by any city department, and to determine, not by asking departmental officials, but by personal inspection, whether every piece of that land was actually being used. Within a month, he had learned that on the Lower East Side there were 9 long vacant strips of land along Houston Street that had been acquired by the Board of Transportation to store equipment during subway construction, but that had been laying idle ever since the construction was completed. 10 elementary schools so old that they had been abandoned by the Board of Education for years, and 5 vacant lots that were owned by the park department itself, but that the park department had somehow not been aware it owned. Alongside the Williamsburg piers were pieces of land that had been acquired to store equipment used in construction of the bridge and had been lying idle during the 31 years since the construction had been completed. On the other side of the East River, among the other tenements, were more piers and more pieces of land. In the Red Hook tenement slums, Brooklyn's version of Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen, 38 acres of land had been purchased for a public housing project, but no such project had begun. Among the flimsy shacks on the Gravesend Bay side of Coney Island, 8 solid blocks of vacation waterfront property was owned by the dock department, but the dock department had no interest in it. And throughout all the city's slums were scores of small triangular gores, where streets angled together or bits of land had been left over from street widening condemnation proceedings that were now just unnoticed pieces of dirt or concrete and that were too small to be used for play, but that were, if planted with grass and a tree or two, large enough to add a touch of green to the drabness around them. Moses asked LaGuardia to direct the City Sinking Fund Commission, the body which, under existing charter provisions, held the actual title to all city-owned land, to turn this land over to the Parks Department. Often, the other departments involved objected to such incursions into their jealously guarded empires. The Tenement House Commission hastily began drawing up plans for the Red Hook housing project to prove that construction on it was imminent. And sometimes, as in the Red Hook case, LaGuardia sided with them. But generally, the new mayor backed Moses. Within 4 months after taking office, the new park commissioner had obtained, in slum areas in which there had been no significant park or playground development for at least half a century, no fewer than 69 separate small park and playground sites. And one that wasn't small. My throat is so dry. North from the Manhattan Bridge, through the very heart of the Lower East Side, through an area in which tenements were jammed solidly into every block, stretched a row of 7 blocks that were completely empty. The Christie Forsyth development, as it was known from the names of the streets which bordered it, was another monument to Tammany Hall and to one of its judges, Joseph Force Crater. 40 years later, Judge Crater's mysterious disappearance would still be unexplained, but contemporary speculation linked it with the judge's unexplained generosity to the owners of the disease-breeding tenements which had occupied those 7 blocks before the city took them over in 1929. I don't really know if that's like a euphemism for something. There's a Tammany Hall judge, which was, and there's these buildings that are a monument to him, and he mysteriously disappeared, and he had unexplained generosity to the owners of a disease-breeding tenement. I don't know what's trying to be implied here. Anyway, I have to just open the Wikipedia tab so I remember to read more about this unexplained disappearance. Judge Joseph Force Crater. This Wikipedia article gets kind of a lot of page views. Like, I've never heard of him, but he's definitely not that obscure. Wow. He just was a New York State Supreme Court justice who mysteriously vanished right after they started investigating corruption. Okay, I'll read about it later. Jimmy Walker, the former mayor, the one who was really corrupt, he had announced with great fanfare that the city would raise the tenements and resell the land at cost to private developers who would erect on it a model housing development. But the astonishingly high condemnation awards Crater bestowed on the owners made the cost so high that the private builders who had previously expressed interests now expressed only dismay. And while the raising had been accomplished, the replacement had not. For more than 4 years, with the lost taxes and interest on the award, the Depression, of course, prevented the city from paying it, costing the city almost $500,000 per year. The tract had lain between the red brick walls that lined it solidly on either side, as flat and featureless as an urban desert. Moses proposed that it be made an oasis of grass, trees, baseball fields, basketball and tennis courts, wading pools, and playgrounds. LaGuardia, trumpeting Page Crater when reporters asked why the housing development would not be built, agreed. The park is now known as Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park. I think I'm going to probably stop there. I'm losing steam. My throat is, I think I had a very social night last night. I was probably out for like 8 hours because I just kept chatting, and then I went to a different friend's house and was just chatting. But my vocal cords are probably not used to me yelling and blabbing so much. But see you later.